Under the pale morning light of late September, the sky over Green Hollow shimmered with a quiet, deceptive calm. The town, if it could be called that, was a cluster of large properties spread across rolling hills, where neighbors were more like distant echoes than faces you'd greet on a porch. It was here, tucked behind a gravel-lined driveway and a simple wooden gate that bore no family crest, no boastful emblem, just the number 211 carved in steel, that Lucas Brady had chosen to begin again. He wasn't new to life's resets. Divorce had taught him how little you truly own, and how fast what you love can disappear. So when he signed the papers for the property 6 months ago, he wasn't looking for a fresh start. He was building a perimeter. Lucas wasn't the kind of man who came with a reputation or tried to invent one. He was quiet, capable, and practical to a fault. He ran a modest repair and modification workshop in the next town over. Nothing flashy, just him, a welder, and a collection of tools that knew more about his past than any friend ever had. He didn't need much: a roof, a good lock on the garage, and peace. And he had all three until the day his ATV was finally ready to ride. The machine itself had been a side project born from necessity. Not a collector's item or a toy, but a utility vehicle, built to handle the rough terrain behind his property and transport supplies through areas his pickup couldn't reach. But Lucas wasn't the kind of man to leave anything half done. What started as a rebuild of an old military surplus frame evolved into a hybrid of traditional mechanics and modern security technology. He had installed a biometric authentication system that combined facial recognition with a unique vocal passphrase. Nothing cloud-based, everything local, hardened, untraceable. It was a silent warning to anyone who might get ideas. And still, the ATV didn't feel like a statement. It was simply smart. Lucas knew how people behaved around what they didn't understand. He didn't want to be the neighborhood eccentric, nor did he want to attract attention. But in Green Hollow, attention found you regardless of intention. The first time Karen saw the ATV, it was during one of those accidental moments of neighborly overlap. Lucas was checking the pressure on the front tires, adjusting the torque on the lugs, when he heard the high-heeled click of her steps on the road. She walked like someone who believed the ground belonged to her, which, in her mind, it probably did. Karen was the kind of woman who wore control like a tailored coat, visible, deliberate, suffocating. Her house sat 2 lots over, pristine and landscaped like a catalog spread, with white trim that gleamed like teeth and a driveway that had never seen a single oil stain. "Oh," she said, as though surprised to find herself walking this way. "That's interesting." Her tone hovered somewhere between curiosity and accusation. "Looks like something I used to see on my brother's ranch years ago. That wouldn't happen to be government issue, would it?" Lucas didn't rise to the bait. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's a rebuild. Nothing special." Karen tilted her head, inspecting the machine like it was a stolen dog. It looks very familiar. Almost exactly like the one my brother had. His got stolen in New Mexico. Nasty business, never recovered." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Anyway, just thought I'd say hello." Lucas nodded once. She didn't linger, but the damage was done. From that moment, she returned to her routines with a new layer of sharpness. Her morning walks became strategic patrols. Her gaze lingered too long on his gate. Neighbors began to ask questions, harmless things, framed as curiosity. So what's Lucas building in there? Didn't know he was such a gearhead. Karen says she had something just like that years ago. Lucas said nothing. He knew better than to feed the fire. Instead, he made subtle adjustments. Cameras that had once only faced the entrance now angled wider, catching slivers of the road. The ATV was moved into the garage at night and locked with both physical restraint and software kill switches. He wasn't paranoid, but he wasn't careless either. Still, there was something about Karen's fixation that unsettled him. Not because he feared confrontation, but because of how confidently she'd made the claim. Not to him directly, but in how she seeded doubt around her. Her words weren't legal accusations, but suggestions, shaped like truth, spread casually with a sip of wine or during a phone call overheard through open windows. Lucas hadn't lived in Green Hollow long, but even he could feel the social gravity Karen carried. She was embedded, known, respected, maybe even feared in that tight, passive-aggressive way wealthy neighborhoods foster. You didn't cross Karen because she wouldn't bark. She'd smile, retreat, and let the consequences find you slowly, like frostbite. He began to notice things that didn't make sense. His trash can overturned in the middle of the night. Packages arriving late or opened. One afternoon he came home to find the latch on the back gate unclipped, not broken. Just opened. Not enough to warrant police involvement. Not enough to accuse anyone directly. Just enough to make you think twice before sleeping soundly. Still, Lucas remained calm. He wasn't going to be bullied, and he sure as hell wasn't going to accuse someone without proof. The ATV became a symbol not of property, but of principle. This wasn't about a machine anymore. It was about ownership, about space, about not letting someone else decide the rules of your life just because they speak louder or smile longer. Lucas had been through worse. He'd faced judges who sided with lies, employers who valued spin over skill, and nights alone that stretched like wire across his spine. He wasn't afraid of people like Karen. He was just tired of being forced to answer to them. But things only got worse when the system he built to protect himself finally did its job, and did it publicly. It was a Saturday, just past noon, when it happened. Lucas had gone into town for parts, and when he returned, he noticed the side door of his garage slightly ajar. Nothing was broken. No alarm was tripped, but the door he always locked was now open. He approached quietly, scanning the perimeter, every step calculated. When he turned the corner and entered the garage, he found the ATV missing. Just gone. No tire marks. No sound. No broken chain. The anchor bolts had been cleanly removed, not cut, not forced. Whoever had done it had planned ahead. Lucas didn't panic. He pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the custom security app. The GPS tracker lit up, pinging slowly from a location less than half a mile away. A private driveway. Karen's. What Lucas didn't know yet, what would only become clear once police arrived, was that the moment Karen tried to start the ATV, the system scanned her face, failed to recognize her, and automatically engaged the audio alert. A custom voice message, robotic but clear, had played over the speakers. Unauthorized operator detected. System lockdown engaged. Authorities notified. And then, as the ignition failed, the machine locked every function and began emitting a sharp, oscillating tone. Neighbors heard it. Karen froze. She didn't flee. She didn't try to explain. She stood there, hands on the handlebars, as the machine screamed under her fingers and her own reflection stared back at her from the silent dash screen. The face that didn't belong. And that was just the beginning. Lucas didn't rush. When he saw the live GPS signal coming from Karen's property, his first instinct wasn't to charge in or shout accusations. That wasn't who he was. His entire life had taught him that emotional reactions gave people leverage over you. Instead, he stood still for a moment in his garage, took a breath, and noted the coordinates blinking on his phone screen. The interface he'd built was simple, brutally efficient, just like the ATV itself. No fluff, no cloud backup, no third-party servers. All data stayed on his personal server inside the house, encrypted and redundant. If someone wanted to tamper with his security, they'd have to break into his bedroom and physically extract the drive. That knowledge, in that moment, was a strange comfort. He dialed the non-emergency police line, calm and precise, explaining what had been taken, how the security system had responded, and where the vehicle currently was. The dispatcher at first seemed skeptical. Who calls in a stolen ATV with military-grade security logs and biometric failure reports? But Lucas wasn't dramatic. He stated facts, included timestamps, and offered the backup data if necessary. The dispatcher's tone shifted halfway through the call. A patrol would be dispatched. While he waited, Lucas didn't pace or watch from the windows like a movie character. He went back inside, locked the door, and opened the camera logs. The feed confirmed what he suspected. At 12:37 p.m., Karen's familiar silhouette entered the garage from the side. She wasn't alone. A man in dark clothing accompanied her. Older, maybe mid-50s, with deliberate movements and a mechanic's tool belt. Lucas froze the frame and zoomed in. He didn't recognize the man, but the posture said everything. This wasn't a crime of impulse or confusion. It was planned. They hadn't just taken the ATV. They had come equipped with tools, disabled the physical lock, and rolled it out without starting the engine, probably to avoid triggering early detection. But they had underestimated the system itself. Lucas flipped to the ATV's onboard logs remotely. At exactly 12:51 p.m., the system had tried to authorize a new user. It had scanned Karen's face 3 times, each attempt registering a mismatch. After the third failed recognition, the vehicle had entered lockdown mode and activated its audible alarm. That alone was enough to flag tampering. But Lucas had added a secondary safeguard. If the vehicle was moved without authorization, it began broadcasting GPS location every 10 seconds to his server. Not through Wi-Fi or cell towers, but via low-frequency radio mesh that he and a friend had developed during a freelance contract years ago. Karen had triggered a technological trap that she likely didn't even understand. When the police cruiser pulled into her driveway 25 minutes later, Lucas wasn't watching through binoculars. He was preparing a folder, printouts of the logs, camera stills, a copy of the hardware spec sheet, and a notarized statement of ownership. He didn't believe in over-explaining, but he believed in being impossible to argue with. At 2:11 p.m., the officer called him directly, asking if he could come identify the property. Lucas said yes, grabbed the folder, and drove over with the calm determination of someone who wasn't looking for revenge, but for resolution. Karen's expression when he arrived was a mixture of disbelief and forced indignation. She stood near the ATV, arms crossed, while the police officer looked back and forth between them. The vehicle, silent now, sat in her driveway like a sleeping animal. Its frame was unmarked, the tires untouched, but the onboard camera, Lucas had double-checked, had recorded everything. Karen's voice, her face, the moment the alarm went off. The officer greeted Lucas professionally and asked for verification. Lucas handed over the folder. As the officer flipped through the documents, Karen began speaking. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice overly controlled. "I told you. I believed this was the ATV that belonged to my late brother. It looks identical. When I saw it unattended, I thought perhaps it had been left or abandoned, and I wanted to verify. I didn't steal anything. I didn't even write it." Lucas didn't respond to her directly. He only turned to the officer. The system was triggered by an unauthorized access attempt. It recorded 3 failed biometric scans and then activated the lockdown. This printout includes timestamps and GPS locations from the moment it left my garage to the moment it was parked here. The onboard camera also recorded video and audio of the access attempt, including the alarm activation. The officer nodded. "Would you be willing to send the footage to our tech team for review?" "I already emailed a copy to the address listed on your department site," Lucas replied. Karen laughed, a high, brittle sound. "This is ridiculous. You're acting like this is some sort of cyber theft operation. It's an ATV." The officer turned to her. "Ma'am, the technology installed on this vehicle qualifies it as digital property under both federal and state tampering statutes. The biometric system constitutes protected access. Attempting to bypass that access without consent can be considered unauthorized digital intrusion, even if no permanent damage is done. Karen's smile faltered. Lucas watched the gears turning in her head. She wasn't used to being corrected in public, let alone by law enforcement. She tried again. I wasn't trying to bypass anything. I didn't even touch it after it started making noise. I stepped back. I told you that. The officer looked at the logs, then at Lucas. Mr. Brady, would you like to press charges? Lucas didn't hesitate. Yes, for attempted unauthorized access to a secured device and unlawful removal of personal property from my garage. Karen's shoulders tightened. You don't have to do this, she said, quieter now, almost pleading. We're neighbors. Lucas met her eyes for the first time since arriving. You stopped being a neighbor the moment you opened my door without permission. The police didn't arrest her on the spot. That wasn't how these things worked. But they did file a report and mark the vehicle as stolen property temporarily recovered. Lucas signed the documents, attached his ownership proof, and reclaimed his machine. It wasn't a victory that felt good. It was a necessary correction, and like most such moments, it came with more tension than satisfaction. Back home, he rolled the ATV back into the garage and double-checked every bolt, every sensor. Nothing appeared damaged, but he reconfigured the system settings anyway. The facial database was cleared and retrained. The vocal password was randomized. The vehicle's perimeter alert radius was expanded by 10 meters. And he added a new feature. Any future failed access attempt would now trigger a full shutdown of all electronics in the garage, including lights and exterior motion systems, forcing a manual reset from a concealed switch only he knew about. That night, Lucas didn't sleep well. He wasn't scared, but he was angry in a quiet, bitter way. Not just at Karen, but at the way she had carried herself during the confrontation, half entitled, half shocked that she couldn't just talk her way out of what she had done. He knew her type, not in the way people use that phrase casually, but deeply. He had spent years dealing with individuals who bent systems to their will by wearing down everyone around them with enough suggestion, enough friendly pressure, until resistance became more trouble than surrender. Karen hadn't screamed. She hadn't thrown things. She had simply tried to rewrite reality in her favor, and was stunned to find that, this time, the facts were airtight. The next morning, things changed. Subtle, but telling. Two neighbors who usually waved didn't. A package from a courier service was marked undeliverable, and returned to sender even though Lucas had been home. One of his business clients canceled a repair request without explanation. The social engine of Green Hollow had been nudged, and now it was turning against him. Lucas didn't overreact. He documented each incident, logged every interaction, and contacted his lawyer again. Not for drama, for records. The lawyer advised patience and offered to draft a formal notice barring Karen from any future contact, physical or digital. Lucas agreed. He wasn't going to fight with words or threats. He was going to build a wall of accountability so high and so dense that even Karen would be forced to walk around it. But something in her eyes from the day before stuck with him. A flicker of something deeper than spite or arrogance. It wasn't fear exactly, but something close. Maybe recognition, maybe guilt, or maybe, just maybe, something darker. Something that suggested this wasn't over. Not because she wanted revenge, but because, in her mind, she still believed the ATV had once belonged to her. And that meant, in her eyes, some small part of it always would. And people like that, they didn't let go. Lucas had always considered himself a man of thresholds. Lines not to be crossed, boundaries both literal and personal that he guarded not out of paranoia, but from a hard-earned understanding of how quickly control could slip when vigilance waned. After the confrontation with Karen, after the police report, After the discomfort of being quietly alienated by neighbors who preferred Karen's version of events over inconvenient facts, Lucas believed that the situation, while far from resolved, had at least reached a plateau. The ATV was back in his possession, its security fortified, the legal groundwork established. He expected some level of passive retaliation, sideways glances, whispered gossip, social disapproval, but what happened next wasn't cold shoulders or awkward silences. It was tactical escalation. It began with a visit from a stranger. Lucas was in the middle of replacing the belt on a client's air compressor when a black SUV with government plates pulled up to the edge of his property, just outside the old cedar post that marked the boundary of his land. The vehicle didn't cross it. It didn't need to. The man who stepped out was tall, wearing dark slacks, a gray button-down with a badge clipped to his hip, and a pair of sunglasses that concealed just enough of his expression to be unnerving. He introduced himself as David Foster, a field investigator with the State Division of Property Compliance. Lucas had never heard of such a department, but he nodded, wiped his hands, and stepped onto the porch, keeping the doorframe at his back like a quiet line of defense. Foster didn't mince words. He said a complaint had been filed concerning the legality of the ATV's modifications, particularly the biometric systems, the onboard alert mechanism, and the external kill switch programming. He spoke in the tone of someone who had done this before, calm but forceful, not quite threatening but far from neutral. According to him, Lucas might be in violation of state statutes regarding personal surveillance equipment, misuse of unauthorized signal frequencies, and unlicensed security protocols. Lucas listened without reacting. When Foster finished his carefully measured monologue, Lucas asked one question. Who filed the complaint? Foster didn't answer directly. He said it was confidential, but Lucas already knew. He could see it in the man's posture, in the way he kept glancing toward the garage like he expected to see a tactical vehicle instead of a glorified off-road hauler. Lucas nodded, thanked Foster for his time, and politely asked for the specific statute numbers in question. Foster hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance in the form of quiet legality, then pulled out a small notepad and wrote down a list. Lucas didn't engage further. He waited until the man left, then walked inside and called his attorney. What followed over the next 72 hours was not a dramatic standoff, not some cinematic siege, but a grueling and precise dismantling of Lucas's routine. First came the letters. One from the Department of Telecommunications, citing an investigation into the ATV's radio transmitter, another from a local zoning office, questioning whether his workshop was up to code. Then came the email from his insurance provider, informing him that his policy was flagged for review due to a high-risk incident involving unauthorized security technology. None of these actions were random. Each had the scent of bureaucratic coordination, just enough to raise alarm without immediately triggering legal defense. Lucas didn't panic. He documented everything, scanned every letter, and built a digital folder categorized by date and subject. His lawyer submitted formal responses, requested clarifications, and challenged the language used in each notice. In parallel, Lucas had an independent consultant verify that all his modifications fell within regulatory bounds. The man, a former contractor turned compliance specialist, reviewed the ATV's internal systems and confirmed that everything was legally sound. No signals interfered with public frequencies. No surveillance data left the property. No laws had been broken. But that didn't stop the tension. 2 days later, someone cut the fiber line feeding his internet. No note, no warning, just a clean break. The cable severed exactly where it entered the junction box near the gate. Lucas found it during a morning check, crouching under the soft light of dawn with a flashlight in his hand and a hollow in his chest that wasn't fear, but a kind of weary disbelief. The message wasn't subtle. You're being watched, and now we're touching your infrastructure. Still, Lucas didn't engage emotionally. He filed a report, contacted his ISP, and set up a temporary LTE failover system using gear from his shop. He rerouted his security feeds through a new private network partition, separated from anything external. He even installed physical shielding around the ATV's garage, reducing external signal exposure. Everything that could be fortified, he fortified. Not because he thought it would stop whoever was pushing, but because it was how he fought. Incrementally, quietly, thoroughly. Then came the incident with the dog. It was late in the evening when Lucas heard the barking. High-pitched, panicked, close. He stepped out with a flashlight, following the sound toward the edge of the property where the tree line thickened. There, tangled in the wire mesh near his tool shed, was a dog. Young, lean, trembling. It had something wrapped around its hind leg, a thin filament line like fishing wire, taut and cutting into the skin. Lucas knelt, murmuring calmly, and cut the line. The dog didn't resist. It just whimpered and collapsed, too tired to flee. There were no tags, no collar, just a faint mark on its left flank that looked like a faded brand. Lucas called the vet he'd used once before, and the woman agreed to come by. As she examined the animal, she frowned. The wound wasn't from a random snare. It was precise, like something meant to trap but not kill. Her words stuck with him. This wasn't an accident. Someone set that up. Lucas spent the rest of the night checking the perimeter. He didn't find more traps, but he did find a set of shallow boot prints near the rear fence, too large to be Karen's, too careful to be from a delivery driver. Oh. He made plaster casts and logged the location coordinates just in case. His lawyer advised caution but commended the documentation. "You're not being paranoid," he said. "You're being smart." But then came the conversation that changed the tempo of everything. It was brief, less than a minute. Lucas was in town, picking up supplies at the hardware store when an older man brushed past him in the aisle. He didn't stop. He didn't look directly at Lucas, but as he passed, he muttered something just loud enough to hear. "You built something that knows too much." Lucas turned, but the man was already gone. No badge, no name, no clear description. Just a sentence delivered like a warning. Or a confession. He didn't tell anyone, not even his lawyer. Instead, he went home, sat in the garage beside the ATV, and activated the diagnostic mode. What he found made his stomach tighten. The log files had grown. There were entries he didn't recognize, strange entries, tagged with timestamps that didn't match system access or user input. The onboard camera had recorded motion when the garage was locked and no one was inside. The face scan logs showed one attempt made at 3:47 a.m. No match found, face obscured by distortion. That night, Lucas didn't sleep. He sat at his workbench, the ATV idling in diagnostic mode, as he watched the footage in slow motion, frame by frame. In one still, just before the lens flared from sudden light exposure, he saw it. A hand reaching toward the camera, gloved, fingers splayed as if to cover or disable. The sleeve showed a seam, stitched, professional, clean. Not Karen, not random, not inexperienced. And that was when Lucas understood that this wasn't just about property or revenge or neighborhood power games. Someone else was involved. Someone who saw the ATV not as a prize, but as a liability. He backed up the logs, stored copies on physical drives, and stashed them in 3 separate off-site locations. One at the bank, one at a friend's auto shop, one mailed anonymously to his lawyer with instructions to open it only if contact was lost for more than 72 hours. Lucas had no plans to disappear, but he wasn't stupid enough to believe he couldn't be made to. The war for ownership had turned into something colder, something calculated. It was no longer about Karen. She'd started it, maybe unknowingly, maybe as part of something larger. But now the game had changed. Now it was about control. And Lucas Brady was not about to give that up. Lucas didn't speak of what he'd seen in the footage. Not to his lawyer, not to the vet, not even to the few acquaintances he still kept in town. He understood instinctively that some knowledge, once revealed, could shift perception in ways that couldn't be reversed. If he said out loud that someone had entered his garage undetected, tampered with a system he personally hardened, and left behind a series of digital artifacts too precise to be accidental, it wouldn't be treated with urgency. It would be met with sideways glances, mental health pamphlets, or worse, dismissal. He had seen enough to know when silence was the only armor left. So he stayed quiet and kept building walls. His first decision was to rebuild the core security kernel of the ATV's onboard interface. He stripped the firmware back to its original state, verified every line, recompiled the image, and reinstalled it manually. No USBs, no networks, only direct serial transfer from an isolated drive. He even disconnected the diagnostic scanner he normally used and replaced the power delivery system with a hardened lithium core cell designed for cleanroom labs. It wasn't just about keeping the machine safe now. It was about knowing whether it had already been compromised beyond repair. If something, or someone, had installed a back door, Lucas needed to flush it out before he made his next move. While the system ran on the fresh build, he turned to something less technical but just as critical: the legal perimeter. His lawyer had filed a restraining order against Karen and it had been granted, but the enforcement of such orders was always reactive. Lucas needed a way to anticipate. He pulled out old property maps from the city planning office and compared them against what was available online. The boundaries didn't align. Subtle changes. Old footpaths that had been erased from records, unregistered easements that ran behind Karen's property and curved dangerously close to his garage. These weren't the kind of things most people would notice, but Lucas wasn't most people. He submitted a quiet request through a third-party title research firm, asking for any irregular changes to deeds in the last 5 years. The results arrived 4 days later. A list of 5 properties in Green Hollow that had undergone modifications to their access rights. Karen's was one of them. She had filed a temporary transfer of ingress to a third party, a trust listed only by registration code and a P.O. box in Utah. The documentation didn't name names, but it confirmed what Lucas already suspected. Karen hadn't acted alone. She had handed legal access of her perimeter to someone else, someone who now had a paper trail that legitimized their presence, even if briefly. It wasn't enough to prove conspiracy, but it shifted the narrative. Karen wasn't simply a manipulative neighbor with a chip on her shoulder. She was a gatekeeper. With that realization, Lucas knew he couldn't play defense any longer. He needed to see the entire board. There was one person who might help. Not a friend, not even someone he particularly trusted, but someone who had a vested interest in unusual behavior around Green Hollow. A man named Eric Reyes, a freelance infrastructure consultant who occasionally moonlighted for insurance firms, investigating fraud, property sabotage, and internal asset theft. Lucas had once built a backup power module for one of Reyes's mobile testing rigs. The man had paid in cash, barely spoke, and had a memory like a locked vault. Lucas called him. They met at a rest stop 40 miles west of town, where the trees were taller and cell service dropped to 1 bar. Reyes arrived in a matte gray Jeep with unregistered plates and greeted Lucas without ceremony. No questions about why they were meeting. No small talk. Lucas showed him the log files. Reyes read them silently, then asked for the serial number of the onboard chip Lucas had used in the original ATV security suite. Lucas wrote it down. Reyes didn't react, but the next question made Lucas stop breathing for a second. "Where did you source the encryption base?" Lucas hesitated. "Private code base. I rewrote it from a deprecated industrial lockout controller I bought at auction." Reyes nodded slowly. "Did you check the chip's microcode against the manufacturer database?" "No. Why?" Reyes didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a tablet, connected it to a satellite tether, and ran a search that took nearly 10 minutes. When the results appeared, he tilted the screen for Lucas to see. The microcode signature, buried beneath layers of user-accessible functions, had a secondary UID. It was registered to a now-defunct division of a defense subcontractor that had gone bankrupt 6 years ago after an internal whistleblower exposed unauthorized surveillance tech trials on civilian assets. The project name was generic, Vector 9, but the implications were not. Lucas didn't speak for a long time. Reyes finally broke the silence. "You didn't build a security system. You rebuilt a node." Lucas asked the only question that mattered. "What does it mean?" "It means someone who was involved in Vector 9 might have been looking for one of these prototypes for years. Your modifications brought it back online. You weren't targeted by Karen. You were flagged." Lucas felt a chill settle over him, a deep, precise cold that started in his spine and spread outward. The ATV hadn't just been his tool. It had become a signal flare. Everything that happened, Karen's sudden interest, the illegal access, the surveillance footprints, the boot prints by his fence, the message in the store, none of it had been coincidence. He returned home with the knowledge that everything had changed. His workshop no longer felt like sanctuary. His routines, once designed to protect, now felt like predictable vulnerabilities. He didn't strip the ATV for parts or destroy the chip. That would have been instinctive, emotional. Instead, he isolated the vehicle completely. He parked it on a steel platform in the center of the garage, disconnected every power source, and ran a Faraday cage around the entire room. Then he wrote down everything. Not just for himself, but for whoever might need to understand later. Not because he feared death, but because he had finally recognized the scale of what he was involved in. The next day, someone left a note on his porch. No envelope, no handwriting. Just typed letters on a square of heavy cardstock. It said, "No one will believe you. That's why we let you keep it." Lucas didn't call the police. He didn't file a report. He burned the note, wiped his hands of the ash, and poured himself a drink. Not because he had given up, but because he had accepted what came next. This wasn't about Karen anymore. It never had been. She had been a test, a gate, a lens, a minor pressure point. The real game had begun the moment Lucas restored that machine, and if they wanted it back, they'd have to come take it themselves. He'd be ready. Under a heavy, slate-colored sky that promised rain but never delivered, Lucas Brady moved through his property with a new kind of deliberateness, not like a man surveying his land, but like someone charting a battlefield. Ever since Reyes had confirmed the hidden legacy of the ATV's chip, its link to a long-dead surveillance project once quietly buried under defense budgets and bureaucratic red tape, Lucas had existed in a suspended state of watchfulness. It was a brittle tension that had settled into every corner of his life, where even mundane tasks now felt like they carried unseen consequences. He no longer went to the grocery store without glancing at his mirrors twice, and he had begun to track unfamiliar vehicles in town not just with curiosity, but with cold, statistical attention. Make, color, tire wear, driver expression. There were patterns, and then there were deviations, and Lucas knew enough about systems to feel the difference in his bones when something broke rhythm. The first new deviation arrived just past dusk, when a blue service van with no decals parked at the edge of the private access road leading to his lot. It didn't pull in. It just sat there, headlights off, engine idling so quietly it was nearly indistinguishable from the low whine of wind through the trees. Lucas saw it through the thermal lens he'd installed on the second-story window a week earlier. No movement inside for several minutes. Then a shape shifted in the driver's seat. Not a stretch or a phone check, just a slow lean forward like the person inside was watching something intently. Lucas didn't respond right away. He didn't grab his rifle or call the sheriff. He simply activated a directional mic and listened. What he heard was silence. Not radio chatter, not idle conversation, just breathing. Calm, paced, patient. He let the moment stretch for nearly an hour before the van finally pulled away, made a slow three-point turn, and drove off without speeding. That was the first night he didn't sleep at home. He packed a go bag, locked down the house with 3 levels of redundancy, and drove the truck to a self-storage unit 20 miles out, where he kept a spare cot and a weather-sealed gear trunk. The ATV remained behind, untouched but encased in shielding. Lucas didn't trust moving it again. Every time he so much as engaged its systems, he risked sending out another signal, accidental or not, that someone, somewhere, might pick up. From his temporary setup, Lucas kept his operations mobile. He conducted his business by burner phone, fielded clients in borrowed spaces, and only returned home in daylight to check perimeter sensors and cycle power on the off-grid solar backups he had installed years earlier, just in case. The irony of that phrase never left him now. It was during one of those cautious return trips that the second escalation became undeniable. The side gate, previously reinforced with double-bar bolts and motion detection wiring, had been tampered with. Not smashed or pried open, but unlocked, as if someone had the key or had picked the lock with surgical precision. Lucas ran diagnostics on the door's SmartBolt history and found a blank entry. Exactly 30 minutes of missing data during a period where the system should have been logging regularly. The camera feed from that side of the property showed a digital blur, like a corrupted file starting the moment before the gap and ending just as suddenly. It wasn't just entry. It was controlled sabotage. Lucas contacted Reyes again, meeting him this time in the rear of a cold storage warehouse operating under a defunct agricultural co-op license. Reyes examined the files silently and whistled under his breath. "Whoever's doing this isn't just good," he finally said. "They're trained. These aren't tools you buy on the open market. This is operator-level ghost work. Someone fed your system a worm and erased their own tracks before your hardware even registered the intrusion. You didn't just flag interest, Lucas. You've been greenlit." Lucas felt the full weight of that word hit the center of his chest like a freight hammer. Greenlit didn't mean surveillance. It meant clearance to engage. It meant whoever was watching had moved from observing to interfering, and interference meant permission from someone high enough to authorize physical entry. Lucas wasn't naive enough to think that meant government in the traditional sense. These kinds of operations rarely had official logos or public funding trails. But it meant access. It meant power. And it meant he was no longer simply protecting property. He was resisting an agenda. 2 days later, it happened again. But this time, there were witnesses. Lucas had returned to his property mid-afternoon to reconfigure the generator backups and cycle battery storage when he heard the distinct crunch of tires on gravel. Tires too wide for civilian vehicles, moving slow enough to suggest confidence rather than caution. He stepped behind the garage's outer wall, peeking through a narrow blind spot between 2 storage shelves, and watched as a black SUV with mirrored tint rolled to a stop near the rear entrance. 2 men exited, one in cargo pants and a plain brown field jacket, the other in jeans and a black crewneck shirt. Neither carried visible weapons, but both moved like they had something holstered just out of sight. Lucas didn't make a sound. He let the security system do its work. Within seconds, the outer perimeter sensors triggered an alert, but no alarms sounded. He had switched the system to silent logging days earlier, knowing full well that audible cues gave away your hand. The men didn't approach the house. Instead, they walked the length of the fence, speaking in low tones too far to pick up clearly, and stopped at the junction box near the utility pole. One of them knelt and placed something small against the metal housing. A disc-shaped device the size of a coin, which Lucas later discovered had short-range wireless sniffing capabilities, designed to collect data pulses from nearby transmissions. That was when one of the neighbors appeared, an older woman walking her dog on the opposite side of the road. She didn't say anything. She just stared, and the two men, without acknowledging her, turned around and walked back to the SUV, calmly, like nothing had happened. The woman and Lucas locked eyes briefly. She didn't wave, she didn't frown. But when Lucas checked his mailbox the next day, there was a handwritten note folded in half and wedged between junk flyers. It read, "I saw them. I didn't speak. I won't. But you're not crazy." It was the first piece of unsolicited truth Lucas had received in weeks, and it confirmed what he had begun to suspect. He wasn't alone in seeing the abnormal. He was just alone in admitting it. That note became his line in the sand. He began documenting every irregularity in triplicate: paper logs, encrypted cloud storage routed through 4 proxy servers, and physical copies mailed to an off-site legal contact under a contingency clause. He drafted a private statement detailing the discovery of the Vector 9 kernel, the sequence of escalations, and the behaviors of the unknown operators. The document included serial numbers, visual descriptions, and timestamps. It wasn't about exposure, it was about legacy. If they came for him directly, he wanted the record to outlive him. Karen returned briefly about a week after the SUV incident. She appeared at the edge of his driveway, not crossing the threshold, just standing with her arms folded, watching the house. Lucas didn't go out to meet her. He didn't acknowledge her presence at all, but through the lens of the thermal scope, he saw her posture tremble, just slightly, a nervous twitch in the hands, a tilt of the head that suggested conflict, maybe regret, maybe fear. Then she left. Later that night, his lawyer called. There had been an inquiry filed under his name with the Department of Homeland Security. Anonymous, unsigned but marked with internal clearance. The claim: that Lucas Brady had access to restricted technology and might be in possession of materials linked to a federal program. Lucas laughed, not because it was funny, but because the timing confirmed what he already knew. Karen had only ever been the spark. Someone else had turned it into fire. The final trigger came when his shop in town was broken into. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged. But the back wall had been tagged with a small symbol, 2 intersecting triangles, 1 inverted. It wasn't graffiti. It was a mark. One Reyes later identified as a dead-drop confirmation sign used by certain former intelligence contractors operating in gray market acquisition circles. They weren't going to take the ATV in court. They weren't going to argue ownership or theft. They were going to wait until Lucas dropped his guard, and then they were going to erase the problem. Quietly, efficiently. Lucas didn't plan a stand. He wasn't a martyr, but he wasn't handing it over either. That night, he loaded the ATV into a rented transport crate under a dummy invoice for non-operational scrap. He drove it to an old friend's outpost in Montana, an off-grid logging cabin fitted with rudimentary defenses and an ironclad sense of discretion. He left the crate there, locked and chained beneath the floorboards, and drove back alone. When he returned home, the house was dark. Too dark. The security system was off. The breaker flipped. The air felt wrong. He didn't enter through the front. He circled to the back, approached in silence, and waited. Someone was inside, but the ATV wasn't. They'd come for it and missed. Lucas smiled. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt ready. The silence inside the house was different now, heavier and more deliberate. Lucas had known what to expect the moment he saw the flipped breaker, the faint irregularities in the gravel near the back door, the scent of stale rubber from boots that had stood too long in one place. It wasn't the first time someone had entered his home, but this was the first time they had done so knowing he might be watching, knowing he might be close. That changed the nature of their presence. This wasn't a reconnaissance anymore. It was a message. A final escalation. They had entered not to search but to make clear that they no longer needed stealth. It was psychological warfare in its simplest form. Show the target you can walk through his defenses like smoke through cracks, and you strip him of his illusion of safety. Lucas didn't rush. He moved to a position where he had visual angles on the 3 most likely exit points and waited. He wasn't armed, not visibly, but the coil of dense paracord in his hand and the weighted grip of the metal flashlight in his jacket pocket were enough if things turned close range. Minutes passed. Then movement near the south-facing window, curtains shifting, a faint shadow repositioning. Whoever was inside wasn't just looting or probing. They were searching with intent. Probably not for the ATV, since he'd already moved it, but for whatever might lead them to it. Data, backup drives, physical copies of the logs. Lucas had removed most of those weeks ago, storing them in scattered safe deposit boxes across state lines. But he knew what he'd left behind. His encrypted laptop, a pair of surveillance reels, and one printed dossier locked in a metal filing case under the stairs. Nothing compromising, but enough to trigger attention. He heard the faint snap of metal as the filing cabinet was jimmied open, followed by a sharp breath. He smiled in the dark. The documents inside were bait, meticulously crafted to look legitimate, detailed enough to seem damning but flawed in subtle ways, like coordinates that led to non-existent parcels or serial numbers tied to publicly available prototypes long since. Decommissioned. Lucas hadn't just planned for theft. He had planned for manipulation. Let them take the files. Let them believe they'd found the trail. It was better than resistance. It was redirection. Eventually, he saw the figure emerge, tall, hooded, moving fast but without panic. The door shut silently behind him. No alarms, no flashing lights. Just the confirmation that the house had been turned, just as he'd known it would. Lucas waited until the taillights of the black SUV vanished around the bend before moving. He entered slowly, checked for signs of secondary traps, then reset the systems manually from the breaker. Lights flickered. The room exhaled. He walked to the cabinet, noted the absence of the folder, and nodded once. Good. It was working. The next morning, he drove to a cafe 2 towns over and met with Reyes. He explained what had happened, how the bait had been taken, and what he believed the next move would be. Reyes listened, nodding occasionally, then leaned back and said something Lucas hadn't expected. "They're going to push you into making a mistake. That's how this ends. Not with confrontation, with a decision you think is yours but was theirs from the start." Lucas considered that. "I've already made my decision." Reyes didn't argue. He slid a small metal case across the table. Inside was a black chip, barely larger than a dime, etched with microscopic serials. "What is it?" Lucas asked. Redundancy. If they find the ATV, if they pull it apart, this will tell them the story they want to believe. Not the truth, just enough to justify closing the file. You install it in the primary interface unit and activate the dummy protocol. It'll override all previous logs and replace them with a ghost sequence I've written. Makes it look like a private mod project that malfunctioned, triggered the wrong signal, and got caught in a bureaucratic sweep. No conspiracy. No stolen tech. Just a stubborn mechanic with poor documentation and a prototype that scared the wrong people. Lucas stared at the chip. And if they see through it? Then you never existed. He didn't flinch. He took the chip, thanked Reyes, and left. Over the next few days, Lucas saw the patterns tighten. The same vehicles reappeared in new locations. Neighbors who had ignored him before now watched him from their porches. One even approached under the guise of returning a misdelivered package, an envelope with no markings, supposedly meant for someone 3 streets over. Lucas accepted it, thanked the man, and burned it without opening it. There was no point. Whatever message it carried was performative. They wanted him to feel watched, controlled. The closer they got to what they believed was the truth, the more theatrical they would become. That was the nature of pressure. It escalated until it created its own illusion of necessity. And then Karen reappeared again. This time, she didn't stay at the edge of his property. She walked up the driveway like nothing had happened, as though months of silence, court orders, and surveillance had been part of some long, mutual misunderstanding. Lucas met her halfway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She didn't smile. That surprised him. Her face was pale, not with guilt, but with something colder. Resignation. She handed him a small plastic envelope. Inside was a flash drive. "They're going to erase you," she said, voice thin. "I didn't know. Not all of it. I thought—" Lucas didn't take the drive. "You thought it was about a machine." Karen shook her head. "No, I thought it was about you. But it's not. It's about what you found. They've already traced the data. They know it's not just hardware. It's historical." Lucas's jaw tightened. That word changed things. Historical meant legacy, meant connection to programs that were never supposed to exist outside paper, to trial runs that operated in civilian populations without consent. The ATV wasn't just a piece of a shuttered project. It was evidence. "Why give this to me now?" he asked. She looked down. "Because they don't need me anymore. They used me. I thought I was protecting my family, my brother's legacy, but they just needed a point of access. I was never the real target." Lucas took the flash drive. He didn't thank her. She turned and left, and he let her go. She had made her choice long ago. Redemption wasn't part of this equation. Back at the cabin in Montana, Lucas activated the dummy protocol, inserted Reyes's chip, and watched as the ATV's internal logs were overwritten with synthetic timestamps, fake route data, and inert firmware histories. It was brilliant. Flawless in appearance, modest in scope. It painted the machine as the harmless project of a backwoods mechanic with an overactive imagination and poor documentation. Just enough mystery to explain the attention, not enough to warrant further investigation. He locked the system, sealed the cabin, and drove back under a sky thick with dust and static. The final act was now in motion. 2 nights later, his property was raided. No uniforms, no sirens, just the soft thud of boots in rhythm, the brief flicker of infrared scanning along the tree line, and the unmistakable sound of a garage door being forced from the inside out. But when they found nothing, no ATV, no files, no trace of recent activity, they left as silently as they came. The bait had worked. They had followed the trail, consumed the illusion, and deemed the subject neutralized. The next morning, Lucas received an anonymous wire transfer to a dormant account he hadn't used in years. The amount was precise: $12,181.03. No message, no signature, but the meaning was clear. This matter is closed. Lucas sat on the porch, the wind dry and sharp, watching the horizon for movement that no longer came. He had survived not because he fought, but because he understood that the real weapon was narrative. He had rewritten his own. Now they believed it, and that, in the end, was enough. In the weeks that followed the quiet raid and the unmarked financial closure of his case, Lucas Brady moved with the kind of discipline one develops only after surviving a storm designed not to destroy the body, but to erase the self. He didn't celebrate. There were no smiles, no exhalations of relief, no illusions about what had happened. He knew the resolution he'd been handed was conditional, temporary, transactional. He hadn't won. He'd simply given them a better story to believe. The line between truth and fiction had never mattered less than it did now. What mattered was perception, and he had become its architect, not its victim. Lucas returned to his routine slowly, but he did not return to his former life. The shop in town was closed permanently. He sold off the remaining equipment in pieces, sending certain items through anonymous buyers in secondary markets, never using his name, never shipping from the same location twice. The house in Green Hollow, once his sanctuary, once the line he defended against intrusion and erasure, was listed through a third-party agent and sold within 4 days to a private buyer from out of state. He didn't visit it again. He didn't pack boxes or walk through the rooms one last time. That chapter was no longer his to reread. It belonged to a version of him that no longer existed. The ATV remained locked away beneath the floorboards of the Montana cabin. Lucas visited only once more, alone, without phone or digital devices, bringing with him only a wrench, a burner notebook, and a single question. Was it still there? It was. Untouched. The logs showed no anomalies. The dummy chip was still installed. The Faraday shielding still held. It wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a time capsule, an object out of step with the world, a relic not from the past, but from a timeline that had been forcibly buried. Lucas stared at it for a long time, considering the weight it still carried, not technologically but symbolically. He knew he could never use it again. To turn the ignition now would be to relight a beacon, to wake the interest he had just barely lulled to sleep. He thought, briefly, of destroying it, melting the frame, burning the internals, scattering the remains in remote drop sites across multiple states. But in the end, he didn't. Not out of sentiment, not out of pride, but because some things deserved to remain exactly where they were, not to be lost, not to be reclaimed, but simply preserved in silence. His new life was quiet and modular. He settled outside a town that didn't have a name anyone outside the county would recognize. He paid in cash. He rented a house with no digital locks and no delivery addresses. He built furniture by hand and sold it anonymously through consignment shops run by people too busy to ask questions. He ate alone. He walked late. He read only paper. The world went on as it always had, with its noise and motion and myths of transparency. Lucas stayed beneath it, not hidden, but unimportant. That was the difference. Invisibility wasn't about absence. It was about irrelevance. Karen never contacted him again. He learned through a legal brief forwarded by his lawyer that she had moved to a different state, changed her surname, and sold her property at a financial loss. She'd never been charged, never publicly linked to the operation that had used her as an entry point. Lucas didn't hate her. He didn't even feel anger anymore. He had come to understand that in a system built on misdirection, people like Karen were never truly villains or victims. They were vectors, vulnerabilities dressed as personalities, activated when convenient, discarded when not. The man from the hardware store, the SUV operators, the technician with the mirrored glasses, none of them reappeared. Their silence was the true closure, a final stamp of disinterest. Lucas knew how organizations like that worked. As long as he remained quiet, disconnected, and forgettable, he would be left alone. The illusion had worked. The story had overwritten the truth. And so Lucas Brady, the man who once built a machine out of stubbornness and necessity, became a ghost not through vanishing, but through control. He shaped the end of his narrative the way others shaped their beginning, on his terms, with precision. There was no redemption arc, no grand vindication, no glorious victory. Just survival. Just peace, earned not by triumph, but by endurance. One night, long after the world had stopped looking for him, Lucas sat outside his cabin with a notebook in his lap and a pen that scratched quietly against the paper. He wasn't writing a confession or a memoir. He was building a failsafe. One last document, stored in a metal case buried beneath a tree marked only by a scratch in the bark. Inside were names, serials, coordinates, and a full record of the real ATV logs, everything the dummy chip had erased. Not for revenge, not for exposure, but for memory. Because stories didn't stay buried forever. And when the ground shifted again, someone would dig. Someone would find. He didn't care who. He just wanted them to have the truth, not because it would change anything, but because it still mattered, even in silence.